Larry here from 7 Sage Law School Prep, and another stick figure exam tip. This one is How to Master Your Professor. The subtitle of this unit is Rommel, you magnificent bastard. I read your book. Of course, the quotes from the 1970 movie Patton, where George C. Scott plays George Patton. And this line comes just after Patton's defeated Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, having read a book that Rommel himself wrote on tank tactics. Tips at this level of mastering your professor are really aimed at the top grades. We have a three-part strategy in doing really well in law school. It begins with mastering the law, memorizing the elements of all the claims and defenses of the subject that you're studying, mastering issue spotting, which is the general skill exercising the muscle of being able to identify and analyze claims and defenses in a new fact pattern that you've never seen. Mastering the professor is the last level, and I order them 1, 2, 3, but really it looks like this. You start with mastering the law, you build on top of that issue spotting, because you issue spot by taking practice exams, but you can't do that until you know the law. You can't master your professor until you've mastered these two skills. But what's entailed in mastering your professor? There are certain ways you can do that. Amongst the easier ones are old practice exams, especially reading the answers that they come up with, and reading their scholarship, which you can do by looking it up on Westlaw or Lexis, or even newer papers on SSRN. The harder exercise is actually listening to what they're saying in class. So let me come back here. This skill actually is critical for that. If you don't know what's going on in the law, it's very difficult to then listen for these much more subtle cues if you just don't even know what the black letter law is to begin with. So one tip is to learn the exact wording of elements, claims, and doctrines as the professor understands them. I had a professor who referred to intoxication sufficient to negate specific intent as Leningrad drunk based on a story of a trip he took to Russia when he was in grad school. Now, this wasn't informal. You had to use the word Leningrad drunk on his exam. He expected it. If you didn't, he would think that you didn't pay attention in class. He told you to do this. But even when the professor doesn't outright tell you to do that, they have ways of wording things that is a shortcut for them. If you say those words, you save time and you buy credibility with that professor. So figure out how exactly they're wording every part of the law. Second is to study and use pet theories that the professor expounds on in class. Let me give you an example. This is the universal symbol for professor, for a criminal procedure class, and this is my second year. I hadn't had time to outline. I borrowed a friend's outline, and humble brag here, I got an A in the class because he was very concerned with a doctrine called representation reinforcement. And he had a decent number of policy questions on the exam. And so I repeated those words like 20 times on the exam. Representation reinforcement, representation reinforcement, representation reinforcement. And that was enough for an A. You want to do this, and you need to be careful to do it well, especially with law and economics professors in torts, corporations, and contracts. And one of the last things is even more subtle than these two, which is to really listen in class for the kinds of argumentation. And this is pretty abstract, structures of argument, methods, even rhetoric that really gets the professor when you watch the Socratic back and forth. Ways of arguing that they find compelling. Ultimately, this is all sort of pandering to the professor, but it's a subtle enough exercise that this guy with the bow tie doesn't want to feel that he's being pandered to. So if he happens to be left-leaning, just spewing left-leaning material at him might not do the trick. Very often, professors like to see creativity and will concede even to policy arguments that they don't politically agree with if they're argued well. So it's this you've got to tap into, and it is the most subtle and tricky thing to do. But if you do these other things well, it's this stuff that will really get you the A on the exam. The professor's background, and I didn't write this down because I think it can be used too crudely, matters in terms of what they find compelling as arguments. In a later video, I'll describe this, but the two states of the world tend to be ivory tower lawyers, your PhDs who have Supreme Court clerkships who've never really worked in the law, and your so-called Hessian trainers who have practiced for a long time and see the law in a very particular way. Different arguments, and this is a big generalization, but different arguments, different types of argumentation make these different groups of professors happy.